All right, a bit about me. As I mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm the director of DePaul Family and Community Services. We are a full service child and adolescent clinic in the Lincoln Park campus of DePaul University. We provide full range of behavioral health services, individual and family therapy, as well as psychological assessment and evaluation services. We have an early childhood program, and we have a growing community program mostly focused on our school-based partnerships. And our partnership with D97 is one of our newest partnerships that we're quite excited about, and I'll tell you a little bit about that program in a moment. I'm also a local Oak Park resident. I have two boys who are D97 students. A little bit about the Mindful Middle Schoolers program. So last year, the Oak Park Township Community Mental Health Board put out an RFP asking for providers to propose unique programs that help address the rising rates of anxiety, depression, and executive functioning challenges that many of our children and youth are experiencing. And certainly these increases in these particular challenges are not unique to Oak Park or River Forest, but really these are national trends that we're seeing increases in these social emotional issues. And so we as a center proposed sort of a multi-tiered model of support. So we wanted to provide support to the entire community via community talks like the one I'm doing tonight, on a broad array of mental health related topics. So we're talking about technology, anxiety, depression, executive functioning, mindfulness-based practices, and just generally the social, emotional, developmental needs of youth, really to equip parents and teachers and students themselves with just information about these topics. Because the more we talk about these things, the less stigma we carry about the topics of mental health, the more knowledge we have about coping with these challenges. The other part of the program is providing school-based support. So we do groups focused on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. That's the primary model we're using. And this is a model that's been shown to help reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression and really train the mind to sharpen that muscle of attention. So we've been doing that over the last school year. We have received funding to continue on next year. And in addition to the two middle schools, we're actually going to be expanding to two elementary schools here in the district. And so we'll announce that a little later in the summer. We're also available to provide individual and family supports, both at school and in the home environment. If you want any additional information about the programming, there's multiple ways to get your child connected. You can refer, parents can request services, teaching staff or school staff can request services, as well as students themselves. So we really made it quite easy for people to request services. So what I'll talk about tonight, I'll just go over some basic facts and statistics about anxiety. What is anxiety? The prevalence rates of anxiety. We'll talk briefly about the brain, so you have a basic understanding of what's happening in the brain of youth related to anxiety. We'll talk about the signs and symptoms of anxiety, the question of nature versus nurture. So what really causes anxiety? The environment or biology or a combination of both? We'll talk about some of the disparities and stigma around anxiety and mental health issues, covering topics like racism and sexism and homophobia and those sorts of things that also play a role in the development of anxiety. I will go over a very brief summary of some of the common anxiety diagnoses, just so you have some of that information. And then the bulk of the presentation really is going to be focused on some strategies for parents and teachers and students themselves to use to support these issues. I will end with a very brief 4-minute mindfulness activity that I really invite all of you to participate in. It's a really nice way to kind of end the day and end on a sense of calm and relaxation. So, prevalence rates. Anxiety disorders are one of the most common psychiatric conditions in youth. It's actually quite staggering, the rates. So 1 in 3 children will meet the criteria for some form of an anxiety disorder before the age of 18. Now, I will go over this later in the presentation, but there's many, many different types of anxiety. And so that's why, part of why, you know, the rates are so high here. But anxiety disorders also co-occur, meaning they happen alongside other diagnoses. So we often see anxiety with depression or anxiety with behavior problems like ADHD and other conditions. We have seen an increase, a dramatic increase in the prevalence rates of anxiety disorders over the last decade or so. And there's lots and lots of hypotheses about this. There's a lot of debate around social media, technology use, and I do a whole presentation on mental health and technology. I mean, the basic takeaway there is that we have seen rates increase while we've also seen access to social media and technology increase. Right now, it's a correlational hypothesis. We don't know that technology is causing these increases, but there's some relationship there. At the level of research, we don't yet know what's causing this. Just to give you another visual here, depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders, you can see that in the middle school years, that 12, when children hit that sort of age of 12, we see a dramatic spike in anxiety, right? And that, we'll talk a little bit about that, what's going on in the brain, hormonally, biologically, that can contribute to that. We also know that kids at that age are becoming much more peer focused. And so the experiences that they have in school settings, for instance, with peers, dating, all of those things can play a role in the development of anxiety. So just a takeaway here is that as kids are entering middle school, we do tend to see a surge in these sorts of conditions like anxiety and depression. So what is anxiety? I like to start by just kind of reminding people is that anxiety is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it is actually quite beneficial from an evolutionary perspective, right? So think about the caveman and encountering or kind of assessing the environment for threats. You know, they're very dangerous predators. And so our physiological system developed in a manner to alert our bodies and our minds that there is a threat in the environment. And so it activates this sort of fight or flight system as a way to protect us, right? So it's part of why human beings have been so successful evolutionarily, is that we have the ability to attack, to run away, to survive in this manner. The problem is when we are not able to sort of regulate that system, and we're translating that fight or flight sort of response to very common everyday activities like going to school or you know, separating from mom or dad. This is when it becomes sort of a problem. So this is another diagram that kind of highlights this, is that, you know, Anxiety and stress can be beneficial up until a certain point, right? So thinking about even our performance. So as I prepared for tonight's talk, I got a little nervous, a little stressed, but in a good way. So it prompted me to practice, to sit down, to get my notes in order so that I could perform adequately at tonight's talk. But if my anxiety or if my stress went overboard, my performance would go down. And so this is what that red line is suggesting, is that at some point, it no longer serves us well. It actually negatively impacts our performance. But I always remind parents and teachers is that it's not our goal to eradicate stress and anxiety. Actually, it can be productive up until a certain point. It can be motivating. It can kind of get kids going in a good way. But we want to be mindful and watch for situations where the anxiety is really kind of taking over and becoming too overwhelming. Let's go over what's happening in the brain. So a couple of things that I want to mention here. So at birth, we were born with some basic neuronal connections in our brain. In the first part of life, in those early childhood years, our brain just rapidly grows and expands. Our connections are strengthening as we get more exposure to learning and the environment. And then as kids enter those middle school years, what starts to happen is something called neuronal pruning. So our brains are preparing to become more adult. They're becoming more streamlined, more efficient. The parts of the brain that are being used are strengthening, and the parts that are not being used are being shed away. So it's sort of like a use it or lose it phase of development. Another thing that's happening is called myelination, and so those remaining branches are being covered with some sort of a fatty layer, and that helps information transfer very quickly or more efficiently between parts of the brain. The other thing specifically related to anxiety is that during adolescence, there is a proliferation of stress hormone receptors. And this is one of the theories by which we understand adolescents to have very high rates of anxiety, is because there's more receptors for the stress hormones that's being produced by the body in our brains. And so the other thing is that there seems to be a higher activity in that stress response system during adolescence, and the length of time that our stress responses last during adolescence are longer compared to adults. And this is really just about, related to the fact that our brains in adolescence are really still in flux. They're not yet at that adult capacity. Some of the two most commonly talked about parts of the brain that are impacted by anxiety is the amygdala. And this is the part of the brain that is really responsible for that fight or flight activation. And so with anxiety disorders, we see an overactive or an underactive amygdala. In research studies, we also see that that part of the brain tends to be larger or bigger in people that have clinically significant anxiety. The other part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, which is right up front. And this is the part of the brain that is responsible for regulation and for executive functioning skills. And there's a strong connection between the prefrontal lobe or cortex and the amygdala, which is more in the middle of our brains. And what we know about people with anxiety disorders or youth with anxiety disorders is that there's an atypical activity between those connections. And so the connection is either overactive or underactive. So it's really having a hard time regulating that that fight or flight response. That's the major takeaway here that I want you to have. The other thing here is that prefrontal cortex that is responsible for emotion regulation as well as other types of executive functioning skills, one of the slowest parts of the brains to develop. It doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. And so this is why our kids are still, struggling emotionally and having a hard time, particularly during adolescence, with the ups and downs of emotions. So the signs of symptoms of anxiety. So basically, anxiety looks different in everybody, but these are some of the common ones that we often see. So recurrent fears, worries, sleep difficulties, trouble relaxing, difficulty separating from parents, irritability, tantrums, discomfort in social situations, body symptoms, somatic symptoms we call them, stomach aches, that's big, headaches, often, those nurse visits to the school nurse are oftentimes, particularly if it's a persistent pattern, can sometimes be related to anxiety. School refusal, sports refusal, performance anxiety, excessive fatigue, quick to overreact, seeking reassurance, and self-harm. All right, so let's talk about the environmental factors that contribute to anxiety, as well as some of the other biological factors. So from genetics studies, we do know that there's a genetic component to the development of anxiety disorders. We know that, for instance, from twin studies, that the more closely related somebody is biologically, the greater chance that they have of sharing similar anxiety diagnoses. We also know that for some types of anxiety disorders, like specific phobias, for instance, we have found some genetic markers for certain types of anxiety disorders. I do see maybe a question in the chat. I'm just going to pull that up really quickly. All right, sorry about that. So interplay with the environment. So there's different ways a child with anxiety might interact with the environment. So there's something called passive correlation. So children of anxious parents may be predisposed genetically, but also impacted by the environment of the anxious parents. So they're developing anxiety sort of secondhand from the parent. They're maybe over controlling, et cetera, the environment. There's also something called evocative correlation. For example, anxious children might actually evoke a negative response from the parent, and then that sort of exacerbates or reinforces the anxiety. And then there's something called selective correlation. For example, anxious children will select environments that are more solitary or socially isolated because of their anxiety, and then that in turn impacts their development. So personality and temperament is also something to think about. We all are born with different personality types. Some kids are very social and other kids are more introverted. I have two boys and one is incredibly extroverted and then the other one is a little bit more cautious and introverted. And I have this diagram here that shows these two individuals who are approaching getting into a water to swim. You know, one is just going for it and jumping in and carefree, and the other person is sort of maybe taking their time. They're a bit more cautious. How we approach our lives depends in part on our personality. And so there's been a lot of research that looks at different personality characteristics that are also associated with anxiety. So things like being behaviorally inhibited, so more kind of reserved, kind of inward, neuroticism, introversion, and non-openness. These are some characteristics that have been associated with anxiety. All right, so parent, teacher, and adult-child relationships. This is another important area. We know that modeling, kids are watching us, right? So as adults, as parents, as teachers, they're learning from us. So if we are really anxious or scared about a certain situation, chances are a child may learn from us how to react and may adopt similar reactions to us. I do have a raised hand here. Let me just stop really quickly. What I'm going to do is if people can, I should have mentioned this in the beginning, if people do have questions, if you could just plop them into the chat bar, and then I'm going to take some pauses periodically through the presentation where I'm going to stop and answer questions. So if you have any questions about anything I'm talking about, please just type them into the chat and I will read them and respond to them periodically through the presentation. Information transfer. So this is really about communication style. So if the adult is very threatening or very catastrophizing, this will also increase a child's anxiety or anxiety behaviors. Over control, so that helicopter parenting, we hear a lot about that in the media. This is really sending a message to kids that they're not capable. They're not capable of managing on their own. And so that can sometimes create a sense of helplessness, a sense of dependency that can relate to anxiety. So we need to, as parents and adults, in a child's life, be encouraging kids in developmentally appropriate ways on how to navigate through the world. The quality of our relationships with kids are also really important. So we know from research and from personal, anecdotal information that if a relationship is not warm, if it's not consistent, if it's very punitive or rejecting, this is also going to increase the chances of a child having anxiety. All right, so other environmental influences. So trauma and adverse childhood experiences. There's a research study called ACEs, stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. This is a range of experiences from from abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, growing up in a home where there's a lot of conflict, separation, divorce, particularly contentious ones. These are things that can contribute to the development of anxiety. Trauma as well. So trauma comes in all forms. Emotional abuse, physical abuse, witnessing somebody die traumatically, racism, oppression, those are all examples of trauma. And particularly if these events happen early on in life and are chronic in nature, so that they happen over and over and over again, this increases the amount of impact this has on later development of anxiety. Sibling and peer relationships. So Close relationships are protective, meaning that if a child has a close relationship with a sibling or a peer, this decreases the prevalence rate for anxiety. We also know that problematic relationships with peers or siblings in the form of bullying, for example, can also increase anxiety. Social media, there is some literature out there talking about the impact of cyberbullying, for instance. We've seen some statistics where like 23% of kids have experienced some form of cyberbullying online. It can also be positive, of course, can offer social support, social connectedness. It can also create exposure to fear-inducing events. Right now, we're seeing a lot of news around George Floyd, the police brutality sort of situation. Watching these sorts of things on our social media feeds definitely creates a sense of anxiety, particularly for kids from underrepresented groups, from minority groups, racial minority groups, definitely impacts anxiety. School environment. So as a culture, we've gotten so focused on performance, and we, as parents and teachers, we're really pushing our kids to excel academically and to get into those top universities, for instance. And this is really putting an enormous amount of pressure on our kids. Academic transitions can be a period of increased anxiety, so that the transitions from elementary to middle, from middle to high school, we see some increases sometimes. The sense of belongingness and community are really important related to the school environment. So if a child feels like they belong, that they have good relationships with teachers and peers, and there's a sense of community there, there's going to be less likely for that child to experience anxiety. Some other areas that I want to talk about. So gender. So in general, girls tend to have a higher prevalence rate for anxiety. And one of the major hypotheses here is what we call gender role socialization. So how we as a society, how we as parents treat boys and girls differently. So we encourage boys to be more, maybe more physically aggressive or demonstrative with their physicality, or their, protective mode, for instance, and maybe girls are taught to be more emotional, and so they're maybe talking more about their anxiety. So it could be both in terms of how we're encouraging kids to express their emotions, but it can also be how we as a society have structured the different roles in the genders. Early puberty is also associated with the increased likelihood of anxiety for both boys and girls. So this is just related to the fact that one's body may be developed much earlier than one's emotional system. And so when there's a mismatch there, that can cause anxiety. Transgender and gender nonconforming youth also experience higher levels of anxiety compared to cisgender counterparts. Cisgender meaning sort of kids who fall more in that normative range or typical range. Race and ethnicity, this is a very varied data set when we look at the research. Some studies show major disparities, and then other studies show that there's no disparity. So it's really hard and varied and complex depending upon the research study. But in general, ethnic minority youth are more likely to report anxiety symptoms. And why is this? Because of our system of discrimination and microaggressions and racial instances of racial racism, systems of oppression, those sorts of things. It can be very traumatic and adverse when it comes to development. African American adolescents, higher rates of general anxiety, PTSD, social anxiety, and fears of police officers and teachers, those in authority figures, authority positions. Latino adolescents, there's some evidence here to suggest that they have higher rates of separation anxiety, and that they tend to experience or express their anxiety symptoms more through body symptoms like headaches and stomach aches. Asian American adolescents, there's very limited research studies on this population, but of the studies that are out there, there tends to be, if a child comes from a very traditional Asian home, traditional cultural values around emotional expressiveness being viewed negatively, then that tends to translate into higher rates of anxiety. So if you're raised in a family where emotions are not encouraged to be expressed, you're going to sometimes see a higher rate of anxiety. Sexual minority status. So LGBT youth experiences higher anxiety.
Es el caso de una señora que se llama Carmen Minerva Colón, que pide orientación. ¿Qué debe hacer esa señora? Pero, en este caso, si la persona...
All right, so as I was saying, LGBT youth tend to experience higher rates of anxiety. Other cultural factors, socioeconomic status like poverty, immigration status, acculturation. Certain cultures have different ideas about what mental health is. Some cultures are very cautious about the mental health system based upon what that system has done in the past to different groups. And so we need to really be mindful of all of these cultural factors when we're trying to understand what our kids are going through. All right, I'm going to pause right now before I talk about the different anxiety disorders to see if there's any questions in the chat. All right, so there's a question about medication, which I am going to talk about towards the end of the presentation, so I'll hold off on that. And then there's types of services offered through D97. What are they specifically? So I did mention that in the beginning, but I will maybe at the end go back to that. If there aren't any other questions at this time, I'm going to continue on with the presentation. All right, so there's, again, as I said, there's different types of anxiety conditions. So one is called separation anxiety. And this is when a child has an excessive fear or inappropriate fear separating from parents or caregivers. So this is the child that, doesn't want to be away from you, doesn't want to separate, doesn't want to go to school, doesn't want to participate in social events if you're not there. Selective mutism, this is a failure to speak in specific social situations. So maybe they speak at home, but they don't speak at school. In a situation where they would be expected to speak, like in a class discussion and those sorts of things. Specific phobia, this is when we have a specific fear about a certain situation, like heights, going up to Sears Tower, or a fear of flying. It's a very specific anxiety, that they don't have anxiety about other things, but just this one thing. Social anxiety, this is quite common, an anxiety about one or more social situations in which a child is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. So this is, in an evaluative situation, maybe they give presentations in class or they perform in a school play, but they're really, really, really anxious about how other people are going to sort of evaluate them or view them in those situations. Panic disorder. So this is reoccurrent, unexpected panic attacks. And a panic attack is a really, usually a brief period of time where there's a real surge of anxiety. And then after that panic attack stops, you start to really worry and get anxious that, okay, this is going to happen again. So there's often a rumination over and over and over again. It's like, when is this going to happen? Is this going to happen again to me? Some people feel like they're going to die, during a panic attack. Agoraphobia. So this is the fear of going outside into public spaces. Fear of using public transit, being in open spaces and crowds, etc. And typically you need to have 2 or more of these, different scenarios in order to meet the criteria for this condition. Generalized anxiety, also quite common, and this is more broad. It's just that the child is having anxiety and worry about many different things, school and home and extracurricular activities and relationships, and those worries have been present for most days than not for at least 6 months. Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder is a type of anxiety disorder, and there's 2 parts to this condition. One is the obsessions, and this is really a persistent, intrusive, unwanted thoughts. So these images or thoughts just sort of keep coming, and they're causing distress, they're causing anxiety. And then in order to cope with those distressing thoughts or that anxiety, the child needs to do something, like a repetitive behavior, in order to help them feel less anxious or to reduce the distress that they're feeling. So they may need to, close their drawer 10 times, or they may need to touch something. So they've developed these compulsions as a way to manage their anxiety. So maladaptive coping can sometimes result if a child has these conditions, right? So again, a certain level of anxiety is within the typical range, but once they become really impacting our school and our relationships at a significant level, we may see some of these more maladaptive coping strategies. So excessive passivity, avoidance of certain situations, anger. Some kids are, start to use substances, or under eating, academic refusal, relationship difficulties, over-reliance on technology, and sometimes in more severe situations, self-harm. I am going to transition into some strategies at the moment, but if there are any questions so far, please put them into the chat and I will answer them. All right, I'm going to continue on. So strategy. So what can we do as parents and teachers to help manage or respond to our kids' stress and anxiety? So we want to make sure that we are, we often fall into this role of being very directive in conversations, and we want to step back and take a little bit more of a listening mode, right? We don't want to lecture kids because that'll just shut them down. We want to create conversations that feel safe, that provide validation. So validation means that we are listening and we're showing that we're listening. And one of the techniques that I like to use is called mirroring. So if a child says something about their anxiety, you're going to say, wow, you know, thanks for sharing. That really sounds like you've been feeling very anxious. So just saying that back to them makes them feel like, okay, my mom or my dad is really, or my teacher is really listening to me, they're hearing me, they're understanding me. We need to be mindful very much of our emotional reactions. So we don't want to, again, be catastrophizing or let our emotions control those situations, because that is going to impact how our children are feeling. Oh, is somebody drawing on the... Oops. All right. Are you all seeing this? There's something going on here with my screen. Let's see. Okay, I'll take a moment here just to answer a couple questions. So there is a question about if your child is showing some signs of general anxiety and you think it might help them to talk to a professional, how would you approach it with your child so that they are open to the idea, especially if the child is not very open to talking about their emotions in general? I think that's a great question. You know, I think kids, particularly the middle school age, they're getting to that age where they need to be involved in the decision-making process as much as possible. I think that it goes back a little bit to how we as families talk about mental health and anxiety. So I really encourage parents to be vulnerable and to talk about their own stress, their own anxiety, long before, you know, these become issues for their kids, to sort of set the tone that it's okay to experience these emotions and these difficulties, and also share, of course, with what you're comfortable sharing of how you have managed to deal with that. Maybe you've gone to see a therapist, and maybe that's been helpful. That can sometimes be a way to get kids open to the idea, at least. You can also sit down and there's a lot of search engines online that you can look at people's profiles, different therapists' profiles. Do that together. You know, what did you like about what this therapist had to say on their website? What do you like about this one? Giving them a little bit more choice and power over what happens when selecting a therapist can be very, very helpful. The next question, how constructive or helpful is it for us parents or caregivers to be transparent with our children about this is exactly what I was saying. I think it's incredibly, incredibly helpful for us as parents and adults to talk about our own mental health challenges, because we all have had moments in our lives where we have struggled with some form of emotional issue. And so if we create an environment where we're talking about it like it's, you know, any other medical type issue, we're breaking the stigma down. We're creating an environment where kids feel like it's just okay to talk about these things. Can you provide some of these search engines that aren't the Psychology Today website? Sure. What I can do is I can send, when I send out the presentation, I can actually send out some links with the slides. All right, I'm going to keep going on here. So parents and teachers, promoting developmentally appropriate independence. So that speaks to that, that helicopter parenting issue that I was talking about here. So we want to make sure that kids are, in a developmentally appropriate way, making their own decisions, developing that sense of competency, that sense of mastery with navigating their environments, with making decisions about school, about maybe what they're eating, maybe what they're wearing, obviously with adult input and supervision, etc. But wherever possible, we're trying to help them build a sense of confidence. Adolescence is a time of risk-taking. One of the other parts of the brain that's really active in adolescence, the most active it ever be, is the dopamine system. That's that pleasure-seeking system. And that motivates kids to not really care about consequences. They just want the thrill, the high, and so risk-taking becomes more of an issue developmentally here. But how can we sort of steer our kids to take healthy risks? Like, you've never been in a school play. What do you think about trying that? That's a risk, right? So guiding them and encouraging them to take healthy risks and to try new things. Anxiety is such a physical condition, right? So when we think about anxiety, what happens to our bodies? Our heart races, and our palms get sweaty, and we get tight, our muscles get tight. And so physical health is so important with reducing our anxiety. So making sure that kids are getting enough sleep. With technology access, we have seen the amount of sleep that teens are getting decreasing, and of course the amount of homework that kids are getting, that's also impacting sleep practices. But generally middle school age kids need about 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Nutrition, eating healthy, physical activity, movement, getting outside as much as possible. So knowing when and how to seek professional help. We've talked a little bit about this already, but I will send out those links that you can access. If a kid's impairment is impacted, so if you've seen a dramatic change in school performance, for instance, if social relationships are just not working, if there's been any dramatic changes in emotions, that might be a sign that you may need to seek some attention, particularly if these are changes that are persisting. I mean, we all have bad days, but if it's going on for weeks, then it may be time to consider talking with somebody. Of course, we're in quarantine right now, and there's a lot of anxiety and stress around, and loss and grief around just what we're living through. And so there is some degree of, we should expect some degree of emotional upheaval right now. But again, we've been now in quarantine for a couple months now. So if those symptoms are persisting, then it may be time to seek help. Talk to your school, inquire about how they're doing, if the teacher has seen anything, or if they've had to access the school nurse or social worker. Sometimes that can provide some additional information involving your middle schooler in the decision. Parental involvement in treatment, this is important, but you also need to do it very sensitively. You don't want to, again, developmentally, the child is probably wanting to feel a little bit more control over the situation. Legally, kids in middle school above the age of 12 have more rights in terms of their confidentiality. You want them to feel safe enough to be able to talk with a therapist. So negotiating that with the therapist and with the child, how much you're going to be involved, can be important. I think it can help with transferring some of the skills to the home setting for the parent to be involved in learning the skills as well. and of course, speaking with your pediatrician. Some treatment options that are mostly well supported in the research, you may have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. This is sort of the gold standard of treatment out there for anxiety and depression. One type of cognitive behavioral therapy is more exposure-based. And for anxiety, what happens is that we tend to avoid the fear-inducing situation or stimulus. And that avoidance becomes reinforcing. So we see a dog crossing the street, maybe we're anxious with dogs, but we walk the other direction. And what happens? Our anxiety goes down, right? So what happens is there becomes an association between us avoiding dogs and us reducing our anxiety. And so it just becomes stronger and stronger, that association. And so gradual exposure is one of those ways in which we're able to reduce the anxiety. We're pairing the anxiety with incrementally fear-inducing situations. So we're starting with something that's very low intensity, and we're eventually working our way up to actually maybe touching a dog or being with a dog. And there's lots of research that supports this kind of treatment. Another treatment strategy is called cognitive restructuring. And this means that we are being mindful of our thoughts. We're noticing what sort of thoughts we are carrying around in our minds. And with those thoughts that are super catastrophizing or are really black and white in terms of the thinking, that can really, really drive anxiety. So if you think, oh my God, if I do this, I am going to die, I'm going to have intense anxiety. So let's look at that thought and let's put it on trial. Let's collect the evidence for and against that thought. So look at the research, read, talk to people, gather all the information and evidence you can, and replace that thought, that irrational thought, with something that's a little bit more rational. So there may be some dangers associated with some situations, but it may not be as intense as you were thinking. Rewards. As I mentioned before, in adolescence, that dopamine system, that pleasure-seeking system of the brain is super active. And so if we can leverage that as parents and teachers, that can be super beneficial. They're more interested in the positive reward than the negative consequences. So the positive rewards are much more motivating to kids in this developmental age than the consequences. And it doesn't need to be a material reward. It can be verbal praise. I really liked that you took out took the dishes out of the dishwasher today, or it was great to see you talking with a friend today outside. Something like that. Just pointing out the positives can go really a long way. Can also be special time together. So if you've seen your teen move towards maybe some progress related to a certain anxiety goal, maybe let's do something special tonight. Let's cook a meal together. Let's watch a movie together. You've done a great job. School-based support. So sometimes a child needs some supports in the academic environment. And if your child has a clinical anxiety diagnosis, you may meet the criteria for a 504 plan or some sort of an academic accommodation plan. So talk to your school social worker if your child may meet that criteria. They will also help assess whether or not a child meets criteria for that. You want to identify support people in the building or on the child's academic team. You want to provide them with information about what's going on, and you want to have a collaborative relationship. To the question of medication. So again, I'm a psychologist. So I'm not a prescriber. Psychiatrists or pediatricians are medically trained doctors that prescribe medication. So just that caveat. But I can talk broadly about the research. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are the most commonly prescribed and most well-supported medication to treat anxiety disorders in children. There's many years of study now that has shown benefits in this area. The approach varies if the child is experiencing mild, moderate, or severe anxiety. So generally, for kids that are having more severe anxiety, medication might be something to consider, or even moderate cases sometimes. And the approach would be a combination approach of therapy and medication. There's lots of research that supports the efficacy of reducing anxiety symptoms with that particular approach, particularly for kids on the more severe end of the spectrum. For more milder cases of anxiety, I think that trying therapy first is the best course of action. But of course, consult your pediatrician or child psychiatrist if you have any questions about that. And then I want to end tonight's presentation talking a little bit about mindfulness. In particular, since mindfulness is an approach that we are using as part of the Mindful Middle Schoolers program, there's been a lot of research coming out recently about how mindfulness can be used to reduce anxiety, to reduce symptoms of depression, and to also strengthen the muscle of attention. For those that don't know what mindfulness is, it really is just about paying attention, using your senses in a very intentional way. So you're sitting down or you're walking, but in a very intentional way, you're paying attention to what's going on in your thoughts, what's going on in your emotions, what's going on in your physical body, and you're just connecting to this present moment. What happens with anxiety disorders is that we're constantly worried about the future. You're like, what is the next threat? What is the next letdown? What is the next criticism that's going to sort of be around the corner? Or we're ruminating about things that have happened in the past. And so it really keeps us stuck in that anxiety. So mindfulness is about coming back to the present moment and using all of our senses to really tap into that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just play a very brief clip of a mindfulness activity that I recorded. And I really would love for you to participate if you feel comfortable. Taking a moment to get into a comfortable posture, one that helps you to feel alert and awake. Closing the eyes if you feel comfortable, and bringing your attention inward. Focused on the body sitting, checking in with and noticing what is present regarding thoughts, emotions, and body sensations. This is an opportunity for you to become aware of what is going on for you in the present moment, in the here and now. And once you are aware of what is going on now in thinking, emotions, and body sensations, gradually shifting your attention to the physical sensations of breathing, using your heart as an anchoring point. You may find it useful to place your hand on your heart while attending to your breath. Notice the expansion of the chest and the abdomen as you inhale, and the deflation as you exhale. Just be with your body breathing for a moment. Finally, shift your attention outward to the entire body around your breath, to any and all sensations. The temperature of your skin, the feeling of clothing on your body. The best you can, bring a sense of openness and receptive attention to your experience in this moment. Allow your attention to expand further into the room, noticing any sensations, sounds, smells, for example. Continue to allow your attention to expand further outside, to your neighborhood, to your town, region, and country. Allow your attention to reflect upon our global connectedness to one another in this moment. And when you're ready, gently bring your attention back to the room. Open your eyes, but hold on to that sense of openness and connectedness. All right, I hope that was relaxing for you. I would love to hear what that was like for you. If people could just put one word maybe in the chat to describe how that was for you, that would be great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause or stop here. I will be emailing you out the slides. And if you could just take a very brief evaluation online as well, that would be great. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint, and I'm going to just take some time to answer some questions. Again, if you do have any questions, please just pop them in the chat and I will respond to them in order. All right, so I'm gonna go through some of the questions. So what's the best strategy for a child who does not want to leave parents' side? Um, Father almost died from a heart attack. So yeah, very obviously that's quite a traumatic situation, and so we're going to expect to see some aggression. We're going to expect to see a child be more clingy during those situations or post those sorts of situations. Um, that child is going to need a little bit more comforting, and so um, I'm not sure if that is necessarily problematic unless it continues to linger on and on and on. And then we might do something like a gradual exposure. So sitting down with the child, maybe setting a goal with her or him to eventually be more separate from parents and to build that gradual exposure framework with the child um, and build in some reinforcements along the way um, might be a strategy that I would try. Let's see. Can you talk more specifically about the support in school? So the program that we're offering is called Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapy, and it is a group-based program where the kids are taught very brief mindfulness activities, similar to the one that I shared with you. These are kids, they don't have very long attention spans oftentimes, and so we're trying to expose them to these skills in very brief spurts. So we do things like breathing activities, we do some mindful movement, mindful yoga poses, we do mindful eating, we usually use like a raisin, we explore the raisin, how it feels in our hands, the smell, the sound. This really teaches them the skills of mindfulness, and then throughout the program, we're kind of building and building and building so that they can sit for longer periods of time or do mindfulness activities for longer periods of time. I know that the schools themselves, like the two middle schools, for instance, are constantly building and developing their social emotional supports. I know that that's a big emphasis for our middle schools. And so some of the social workers are also offering different types of groups. I know there's like a CBITS group, for instance, I think at Julian. This is one for kids that have experienced trauma, for instance. Um, but I know that that's a goal of the two middle schools is they really want to build out more of these sort of in-house supports. How do you deal with a child who refuses to acknowledge anxiety, even in therapy? Yeah, I mean, there are many people, not just children, even adults, that don't want to talk about emotions or have a hard time talking about emotions. I think that it's really important to focus on creating a sense of safety in the relationship, in the therapeutic relationship. And sometimes for some kids and for some adults, that takes a really long time. Um, and so, you want to obviously be talking with the therapist and figuring out sort of where they are along that process of, forming a relationship. At times, sometimes the relationship may not be a good fit. You know, I don't know this particular situation, but definitely talk with the therapist and your child about how they're feeling about um, the relationship, the strategies. Some kids really respond to a much more directive approach, and then other kids um, love that they just come in and they talk about whatever. So it might just be a case of fit. But you could also do like a gradual exposure if it's a cognitive behavioral type approach. Sharing one thing that's, low anxiety, and then gradually building your way up to talking about something that has more anxiety intensity. If you're looking for a professional, who do you start with? A psychologist, a therapist? If so, what kind of therapist or background should you look for? So both psychologists, licensed clinical social workers, licensed clinical professional counselors, these are all people that are usually well equipped to work with these sorts of issues. You just want to obviously find somebody that has experience and interest working with the sort of child age population of your particular child. And I would, as a parent myself, I would be interested in finding a therapist that does have some experience with some of these more research-based treatment models, like cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. These are the types of treatment models that really have shown to be effective. Let's see. Yeah, not all pediatricians will prescribe meds, you're right, particularly for more complex or severe cases of emotional health issues. And so, and it's very difficult, you're right, to find particularly child psychiatrists, and they often have long waiting lists. Some practices, some psychiatrist practices are using nurse practitioners as a way to increase access. I do know of some practices in Oak Park that use nurse practitioners, and I have found that it's sometimes easier and quicker to get into those sorts of practices than sort of an individual psychiatrist. And if anybody has questions about that, feel free to reach out to me. How is D97 helping kids acknowledge anxiety due to COVID-19? I'm not entirely sure how D97 is handling that. I know from our program, we did develop a talk that speaks specifically about how children and families might be experiencing a pandemic, and then also strategies for coping. I do have that recorded as well. I'm happy to send that to anybody. We are continuing to offer our supports virtually, so we're running our groups via telehealth platforms. So for kids that are experiencing anxiety, we're still providing treatment. Yeah, I'm concerned that the pandemic has made my son more anxious. He continues therapy, but I worry about his lack of socialization due to pandemic. As my only child, any tips to help me make him feel calmer about now and the future? Yeah, I could spend probably the next hour talking about that as well. And again, I'm happy to send, if you want to send me a quick email, I'm happy to send you the presentation that I gave on coping with pandemics. For some kids that struggle with social anxiety, the pandemic situation is actually, it feels less anxiety producing for them because they're not having to do all that social interaction at school. So I have clients who have really, their anxiety has gone down. And then for other kids who maybe are more social and have lost a lot of their in-person social contact, I've seen the opposite, where they're really struggling. I would encourage you to think about and talk with your child about how to possibly build in some safe, maybe physically distanced socialization or socialization via technology, just to keep certain relationships going. When will yesterday's presentation be emailed out? We did one yesterday on mindfulness-based strategies. There were some glitches of uploading it to the website, but I have it now, so I will send it out probably in the next day or two. My email address, so when I email out the presentation slides, it will be in there. You can also reply to the email that you probably received for the Zoom link, and that'll also get to me as well. What are some of the D97 resources that I mentioned? So, well, as I mentioned, we are doing groups at the school, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy groups. Some of the school social workers are also running groups on their own, more trauma-specific groups. If you have more specific questions about that, I'm happy to try and answer that by email. So if you could email me, that would be great. All right, everybody, it is 7:45, so I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you all for attending, and please reach out if you have any questions. Have a good night.